up before polls even opened, despite heavy rains across the state. According to the U.S. Elections Project, nearly 30 million people across the country have already voted. To give you some context, that's nearly 20%, a fifth of the total votes counted in the last presidential election, already notched. Now, there's two ways it's happening. Early in-person voting, like what you're seeing in those lines there, which is pretty straightforward, and of course, mail-in voting, which is less straightforward. Right now, only 18 states require that voters be notified if there's a minor issue with their absentee ballot, like a missing signature, so that they have the opportunity to fix their ballot in time for it to be counted. Other states just don't have that protection. So ballots are already being rejected across the country. And in Texas today, 3 judges appointed by Republican presidents ruled that the state can reject a mail-in ballot over a signature discrepancy without giving voters a chance to fix it, because doing so, according to the court, would compromise the integrity of mail-in ballots. Quote, Texas's strong interest in safeguarding the integrity of its elections from voter fraud far outweighs any burden the state's voting procedures place on the right to vote. Election law expert Ned Foley has been studying the courts and the fragility of this process for years, and Judith Browne Dianis has been fighting voter suppression for decades with the Advancement Project National Office, and both join me now. Judith, let me start with you. This is obviously an area of significant concern about absentee ballot rejections, particularly because, and I will say this, having voted absentee earlier in the spring, it is a little complicated. Like, if you haven't done it before, I was a little panicked that I was missing something and what to sign and what to do it. And then there's also, data we have that shows that there are some real racial disparities in these rejection rates. What's your read on where things stand on this?
Sure. Well, Chris, it's funny. I actually just did mine on Saturday, and I had to read over the instructions like 3 times to make sure that I was doing everything right, because we know that little technicalities can result in rejections. And we're seeing African-American and Latinx voters being rejected more often. And part of that is because, yes, there are technicalities, but second is that this is the first time that many voters are voting by mail because of the pandemic. And so this is new to voters, and they have to know that they have to follow all of the instructions. And some of them are silly, right? Like, rewrite your address. Well, you know what my address is. Sign here. You already know my signature. And then we have the whole problem of signature matches, which is like, the people who are doing the signature matching are not experts. So it's a problem.
Ned, this Texas case was interesting to me, right? Because you got a bunch of states that say, yeah, you can, you've got essentially, you've got a right to fix this, right? If we get it early enough and we flag something, you can find out and, we can deal with it. In this case, you got 3 federal judges who say there is no right, and the state has a compelling interest to toss these ballots if they want to toss them.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of this ability to cure. I was part of a bipartisan program that the American Law Institute did over years, and said every state should have this kind of cure possibility, but some states don't. And so the Texas case involves the constitutional question of whether states must do that, even if their legislature doesn't provide it. And these Texas judges had a very strict interpretation of the Constitution.
We've got another big case that just happened, which I think is worth discussing because we have so much litigation. This is the Supreme Court not taking a case, which can sometimes be huge news. And this seems pretty big. This was basically the state Supreme Court of Pennsylvania basically came in and said, look, we're going to count ballots 3 days after they get to their election day because of the unprecedented volume, and as long as they're postmarked. That was challenged by the Republican Party, the Trump campaign, to federal court and the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court did not take it. It was a 4-4 tie. Roberts siding with the 3 remaining liberals, the other 4 conservatives saying, no, we want to take this and not affirm that lower court position. Let me start with you, Judith, about what you think this portends, what this means.
Well, I mean, part of the problem is that Republicans have been fighting this year to create more barriers to the ballot box, whether it's fighting over the number of drop boxes in a place, the deadlines for when you have to return it. This is their playbook this year, right, is to make it harder for people to vote by, in a pandemic. And so I think what we're seeing in the Supreme Court, and we'll see in a lot of cases, is that courts don't like to, at the last minute, enter into election law, fearing that they might change the outcome. Our problem is that we think that they should when it allows for greater access to the ballot, not when it restricts. And Chris, I also want to mention, remember, we're also missing a very important part of the Voting Rights Act in this presidential election so that we don't have the opportunity to check the discrimination before it happens.
It's a great point. Ned, you know, this is what Judith is referring to is what's called the Purcell Principle, the idea that you don't change the rules of elections very close to the election. And there's some obvious, I think, thoughtfulness to that. But we've gotten a weird application of it where lower courts will say, no, you have a right to do X. And then the appellate court will come in and say, well, according to this principle, not to change things, we're going to change what you just said to revert back to the original. And you end up with, it seems to me, like vitiating the principle if you're sending people constantly updating and confusing signals.
True, all true. 2 points about this case that I think is important. One is it was coming from the state Supreme Court, not from the lower federal courts. Right. The Purcell Principle is primarily come out of lower federal courts. So I think Chief Justice Roberts, I think, was cutting the state Supreme Court more slack.
Yes.
But because it's a 4-4 case, that leads to my second point. There's a 9th justice that may be arriving on the Supreme Court soon. And, you know, we don't know how that would go, but it leaves a big question mark. What does this case signal in terms of how a 9-member court would decide it?
It's a great point, and Judith, and maybe that's a great place to end here, which is that the President of the United States has been extremely explicit about this. He wants Amy Coney Barrett on the court precisely to rule on the election outcome, which he says he expects to go to the court, and Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham agree. And implicit in that also is that they don't trust Roberts. They think he's a squish. And so this does seem to kind of tee
Which is
up,
amazing.
Well, right, exactly. I mean, the guy that wrote Shelby County gutting the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
But this does seem to tee up that scenario.
Right, and he's always wanted to go after voting rights. He wanted to go after voting rights when he was a student and part of the Federalist Society. And so now, yes, Trump has to get this last person on the court because he's teeing it up for a Bush v. Gore type of challenge and to make sure that he's covering himself. So unfortunately, that's where we are, and hopefully we're going to be able to stop this nomination from going through. We'll see.
I don't know if that's going to happen, although, Ned, you and I have discussed the fact that the margins matter a huge amount here in terms of what we see. And in terms of what we see election night, I mean, for all the talk about this extending for a very long period of time, Florida and Arizona should both have their votes counted election night. There's a universe in which they count them and we know.
True, right. We have to be prepared for different scenarios on election night, one of which could be an early signal in favor of Vice President Biden. Won't be a definite result yet. You don't get official results till you get certified vote tallies for a couple of weeks, but be prepared for different possibilities.
Ned Foley and Judith Browne Dianis, thank you both so much for making time tonight. That is all in on this Monday night. The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening, Chris. Thank you, my friend. And thank you for your counsel over the course of today as a workday as to what counted as news that should be on TV. It was such a weird day today.
I'm always happy to have those very high-level editorial discussions with you about the most important stories in our world.